Well, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and yes, I have a nice little PacWest Bigfoot encounter story for you. I want to say it's been a while. I do want to say thank you guys so very much for just putting the pressure on me to at least keep up here and there as much as I can with the encounter stories here at PacWest Bigfoot. And I just want to say I really appreciate you guys. You know, I've decided that I'm going to go ahead and try to do more than one Bigfoot encounter story every month. I've decided to go ahead and try to do that now. I can't. Don't count on it. just just please do me a favor. I'm gonna really try to get them out here as often as I can going forward. What I want to do is just say thank you so very much for the patience and everything else. I just got so busy with, my work that I do here online. And you all know that I do this because I just totally enjoy the subject. I have had my own brief encounters and have come across footprints in the woods that I have no idea why they were there. They just were. And you guys have heard that before, and I've talked about it. Now, going forward, I will not be doing any more interviews with individuals and their Bigfoot encounters, at least not for the time being. But I will continue to try to get these encounter stories out to you as often as possible. So, in a way, I guess you could say, and I hope you say, welcome back. With that, let's get into today's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story, Bigfoot Halloween and the scare of my life in Butte Falls, Oregon. My folks said it was okay to share my encounter with you that happened barely 4 years ago in Butte Falls, Oregon. It was a real scary encounter, one that we decided to keep to ourselves, except for this time right here. It was Halloween when I'd come across the scariest looking monster I had ever seen in my life, and hope never to see again. I was really, really scared. Even today, my mother hardly lets me walk up the road home from school, even during the day. So, here is what I saw and what followed me all the way home that Halloween night. Hocus pocus, it's Bigfoot. I was almost a year off from starting high school, about a year and a half, when this happened. So yes, I was in junior high. I wish I could say it was or am one of them football playing size kids, but the truth is, I had my issues with bullying from time to time back then. However, I do stand my ground, did stand my ground, and do not mind and did not mind getting into a good fight if I had to. I may have been small and skinny, but I have given a good nosebleed once or twice. So, being scared of other kids, I would say I have no real fear, other than that of getting in trouble for fighting in the first place. Actually, my interests are video games and card games. No, not poker, but fantasy card games. I also like to read, and my favorite is The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Maybe that is what gets me picked on, but I don't care, as I said. Butte Falls is a small town, a real small town. More like a blip on the map between Eagle Point, Oregon, and camping at Willow Lake. I can add this too. My father said there was a news report back in the 80s of a Bigfoot up at Willow Lake on the south side near the campsites. So personally, I guess they lived around here if you ask me, because I know for sure I saw one that night. Mom and Dad and work. My dad worked as a truck driver, and most of the time he was hauling lumber for a local lumber mill. My mother, well, she worked as an in-home care provider around the Rogue Valley. Sometimes that left me in the care of my aunt, who lived in downtown Butte Falls when both of them were running late or were gone for an entire night. That Halloween, they'd be gone. Dad was on a 2-day haul, and my mother was going to cover for a friend she'd owed some time on the clock for. It was the first time, however, that they'd let me go trick-or-treating alone. Well, with some friends and their mom and dad. But for me, it was the first time I was feeling like they were really treating me as a young adult. My parents are great, but they, like many parents, can be a little overprotective at times, even now. It was colder that Halloween, I remember. Frost and even a few flakes were felt of snow a few days before. Strange. But it was a clear and chilly day that Halloween, and I think it was a Friday. I decided that year to go as Frodo Baggins. Yeah, I had a few of those bullies making fun of me, but for the most part, my mom and aunt did a great job with the costume and even picked up the shirt and pants from the yearly sale at the Shakespeare Festival in Ashland. So, suffice it to say, it was pretty cool and looked really authentic. That day was long, it seemed. We were all chomping at the bit to get out, get home, and get some candy that evening. I know I was, that's for sure. Finally, the bell rang, and I was on the bus. What in the world? I was going out to a friend's house for a couple hours, then back to my aunt's after she picked me up. We would eat dinner, get my costume on, and head out for some trick-or-treating. But the plans changed a bit as I found myself back at home. That is when I learned that my mom and dad would not be home until the following day, so we were just going to go hang out here all night. Of course, that was after trick-or-treating. My aunt was not known for her cooking. As a matter of fact, she was a decade younger than my mother, her sister. But when we did arrive at the house, my aunt noticed the boarded fence down a ways from the driveway was broken. The top board had completely come off in that section. It was fine earlier that day when she dropped off some groceries before coming to get me. I guess you could say that is where the weird stuff would start. It was not dark yet, but it was getting there, and we decided to eat real quick. She made some type of soup that she swore was something else. Either way, I was taught to eat it and like it, even if I didn't. I got up after dinner and headed to my room to get my costume on when I heard something pretty heavy take off. At least it sounded like it was running off from next to the window. I walked over and to take a look around outside, but I saw nothing. Besides, you can't see past my room that far in the early evening or late afternoon. The woods are thick around the house. The side of the house was about 20 feet away from a line of trees where the rest of the forest started. Whatever it was, it sounded heavy, and it sounded like it was running off, maybe galloping, but I was not sure. I told my aunt, and she said it was probably a black bear. She noticed some large impressions out by the fallen fence before she started dinner. No footprints, though, just some impressions. She told me that they were pretty much harmless, something I already knew living around there. Trick or Bigfoot? I was dropped off in town, which I lived just a few minutes on the outskirts of. I was allowed to walk back home, starting at one end of town and trick-or-treating my way back. I had friends. Not everyone was a bully. We all started on the south of town and started weaving our way back and forth through town for over an hour. Although the town was really small, there were enough folks here to get a decent cache of candy collected in that amount of time. It was just about dark when we were hitting the last street, and when finished, I would head home and hit a couple houses I knew along the way. The walk would turn into a fear-filled and fast-paced walk that turned into a sprint, it felt. We hit the last house, and I turned up the road that would take me home. It was Halloween, so yes, I had thoughts running through my head of things scary and even macabre to a point. So, at first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, or perhaps it was just a person trying their best to freak me out. I had two stops on the way home, and each had a short driveway. I would have to head down. The first one was a treasure trove of nougat bars and some blow pops. The next house, a friend of my parents we knew well, she was a bit startled by me showing up, I noticed. I knocked and heard her let out a short shriek from inside. She was an older lady, to be honest. Really old, but really nice. She opened the door, and after I think looking through her peephole, she immediately seemed to settle down a bit when she saw me, but she did ask me to come in. I did. She asked me while filling up my bag with some candy bars if I had seen anything odd or noticed any animals, at least, while walking up the driveway. I did not, I had told her. She seemed pretty bothered still, and I was asking if she could call my parents and have someone pick me up. I told her my parents were gone, but I did not tell her my aunt was there. I wanted to walk home myself, call it independence or whatever, but that is what I wanted. I headed out, back down the driveway. It was not 45 to 50 yards later that I heard something following me to the left off the side of the dirt road. It was really dark at that point across there, but there was still a bit of dusk left, just enough to see a bit of movement suddenly. Whoever it was seemed pretty tall, most likely a senior at the local high school or some crazy adult trying to scare me like I don't know. You know how it is on Halloween night. But I was sure I saw a figure for the briefest of seconds. I decided to get back to walking, so I yelled over into the direction of the tree line that I saw them and they could head back to town and try to scare the little kids. A shrill scream in the night. I started walking again, as I said, but moments later, the same person, well, what I thought was a person at first, started walking just inside the trees again. This time, however, I found myself ducking into the ditch. Well, falling over into it, actually. Whatever this thing was, it started screaming. A shrill, high-pitched, and ear-piercing scream that I knew was not human. I lost one of my fake hobbit feet when I spilled over into the ditch, and I started freaking out, even crying a bit, thinking that suddenly there was a real-life monster in the woods across from me. I started hearing what seemed like grunting all of a sudden, and I mean real raspy huffing and puffing type of grunting. Whatever it knew I was there, and it was extremely interested in me. I peeked out over the side of the ditch, and I could see a large person-like figure looking right back at me. It was a Bigfoot. Well, it looked just like the ones I'd seen in a book here and there in the library. I was terrified, as my mom would call it later. It stood there on the opposite side of the road, just inside the tree line, but clear enough to see this was not a person in a costume and mask. It was a literal monster. I could not see its face too well, but I could see there was almost no neck, and its arms were really long, and I mean really long. It was at least, I'd guess, about 9 to 10 feet tall. It was huge, that's for sure. This thing, I thought, was going to kill me, eat me. I'd be a pile of leftover guts in moments. I sat there looking at this thing, and it stared back at me, and all the while, I will admit, I peed myself and started sobbing. It stood there for what seemed a lifetime, but had only been seconds, I suppose, before it moved off into the trees where it had come from. But I could still see its silhouette just inside a bunch of pines. I was sobbing, wet, and it was getting pretty cold pretty fast. I remember I could see my breath all of a sudden. I started to get the nerve to move. Actually, I wanted to run and not look back, but I knew with as far as I had to go, I might make this thing chase me or set it off. Then I knew I would be dead. I started walking, and just as I did so, this thing screamed and barked at me again. It also revealed itself in the facing light again. This time I saw the white of its teeth. And his face was straight out of a horror movie. It looked almost like a deformed monkey-like man. Its arms really did reach past its knees, and, for you serious hunters out there, its eyes seemed to have a glint of red to them. Why, I don't know, but maybe you do. Its hair was really long, maybe 3 to 4 inches at least. It was tangled, almost dreaded, it seemed, and maybe it was just dirty and matted down in spots. But it was, or so it seemed, as black as night in color. Tricked and no treat. It kept following me, and I kept sobbing and wondering when this animal or creature, better yet, was going to pop out and tear me apart. But it didn't. It just kept screaming, barking, and popping in and out of the woods. I felt like it was teasing me in a way, or just toying with its meal before it took it down, like a cat in its toy or something. I was walking fast. I felt like sprinting again, but like my dad said when we moved out here, when you come across a wild animal, son, don't run. Stand your ground for a second or so, then move off slowly, and don't run ever. I did want to run, and Actually, I started to sprint for a second and then thought about all that and stopped. But I ended up doing what my dad said, even tried to keep the sound of my sobbing to a minimum. Looking over in the woods, even though I did not want to, I still saw that thing walking or standing just ahead of me, staring me down and still from time to time barking or yelling at me. I was probably about 100 yards from home, maybe a bit more, when that thing gave out the loudest shriek and started running off into the woods westward. Just then, the headlights of my aunt's car came around the bend. At the same time, I fell to my knees, crying out loud, saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," up into the air. Pumpkins and monsters. My aunt received a call from the neighbor about 5 minutes before she came around the corner. Apparently, the neighbor heard the commotion down the road, and because of what she'd heard and experienced earlier that evening, well, she was worried about me. Thank goodness she was. My aunt called my parents, and for about an hour or so I told them what I saw and what had happened, even peeing myself. After that incident, my mom would not let me walk home from school any longer that year or the next. Today, and now attending high school, I am not all that freaked out about the subject of Bigfoot, although I do not wish to have another encounter, mind you. But, even with my encounter, on that scariest night of my life, well, I know they exist now. I have seen one. And that is my encounter story. Thanks. Rock.